Okay, right. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Leon Litvack, who will be talking to us this morning. Leon is a reader in Victorian Studies at Queen's University Belfast. He's principal editor of the Charles Dickens Letters Project and a world authority on Dickens's correspondence and manuscripts. He specialises in microhistorical and archival approaches to Dickens and currently holds UK cabinet appointments to the Advisory Council on National Records and Archives and the Forum on Historical Manuscripts and Academic Research. His most recent publication is a collection of essays entitled Reading Dickens Differently from Wiley, featuring an essay in which Leon considers the mysterious circumstances surrounding Dickens's death and burial and implicates the self-seeking individuals who conspired to deposit his earthly remains in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. This new research will be the subject of his talk today, which is The Plot to Bury Dickens, Capitalising on the Demise of Victorian Celebrity. So thank you, Leon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now. Dickens's sudden death 150 years ago today created an almost irresolvable predicament for those closest to him. When and how was he to be buried? Who was to attend the funeral? Was his lover Ellen Ternan to be present? Would his estranged wife Catherine be invited as well? Would it be a public or a private event? Would the author's own wishes concerning his final journey and ultimate resting place be respected? Or would these decisions be taken by others who may have placed their own interests before those of Dickens himself? My 3-year quest to answer these and other questions began when I received from Bob Patton an image of a letter in the archives of the Armstrong Browning Library in Texas, sent to me to decipher the handwriting. It was from Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, and addressed to his brother-in-law, Frederick Locker, a bibliophile, poet, and friend of Dickens. It was dated 150 years ago today, the 9th of June, 1870, and reads as follows. My dear Fred, alas, how soon we have been overtaken by the event which we were anticipating as so distant. I cannot amply thank you for having given me the opportunity of having met Charles Dickens while there was yet time. You will gather from what I have already said that I am quite prepared to raise any proposals about the burial that may be made to me. I was caught completely unawares by the content, but immediately realized its significance. What's most striking is the date of writing. How had Stanley learned of Dickens's death so quickly, and from whom? Also, what was the motivation behind his instantaneous offer to bury Dickens in the Abbey? It's clear from the content that Stanley and Locker talked about the burial before this letter was written. In his memoir entitled My Reminiscences, Locker recorded an interesting conversation he had with Stanley before the Dean's meeting with Dickens, which occurred in February 1870. The pair were speaking of the burials in the Abbey, and they discussed the names of some distinguished people. Stanley told his brother-in-law there were certain people he would be obliged to refuse burial, including Carlyle and John Stuart Mill, on account of personal antipathies. But his attitude changed when the name of Dickens came up, and he said he should like to meet the author. Then, to gratify Stanley's pious wish, Locker asked Dickens and his daughter to dine. Thus, even while Dickens was still alive, Stanley privately expressed a desire to bury him. Locker quickly seized the opportunity hinted at in Stanley's letter of the 9th of June, and the next day sent a copy of it to Charlie Dickens, the author's son. He wrote in his covering note, I wish to send you a copy of the letter that I have just received from Dean Stanley, and I think it will explain itself. If I can be of any use, pray tell me. In order for an individual to be buried in the Abbey, the deceased's family had to make an approach to the Dean. Without this, Stanley was powerless to act. But it's interesting to see the increasingly energetic efforts he made to reach out to the bereaved family so that his own plan might be achieved. Meanwhile, the idea of getting Dickens to the Abbey was growing larger in Stanley's imagination. He wrote to his cousin Louisa on Saturday, the 11th of June, to say, I never met Dickens till this year, and now he is gone, and it is not improbable that I may bury him. It's interesting how quickly the plan crystallized in the Dean's mind. Within the space of 48 hours, he went from hypothetical proposals from the family for burial to foreseeing a key role for himself in the proceedings. Unfortunately, an answer from Charlie Dickens wasn't immediately forthcoming. Stanley waited until the morning of Monday, the 13th of June, before employing another route to contact the family. He got in touch with his friend Lord Houghton, formerly Richard Monckton Milnes, a poet, politician, and friend of Dickens, reiterating his offer. He said, "On hearing the news of the death of Charles Dickens, I communicated to his family through Frederick Locker that I should be ready to receive any proposal for his burial in the Abbey. I have no intimation of any kind, and it is possible that they have determined against it. The usual course in these cases, and the most suitable for obvious reasons, is that friends and distinguished persons should present the case to the Dean and ask for his approval. And I am unwilling to depart from this precedent because, if the Dean were to take the initiative, a funeral of this kind would be regarded as an expression of his individual feeling rather than of the public sentiment. But I am unwilling that a tribute of this nature, if desired by the public and the friends, should miscarry through any misunderstanding. Hence this note. Will you kindly act as you think best?" It's clear from this new evidence just how much Stanley wanted to bury Dickens in the Abbey, and the lengths he went to ensure that his goal was achieved. The Dean occupied his position from 1864 until 1881. During this time, he displayed an extraordinary interest in the Abbey's graves and memorials, even opening tombs such as that of Henry VII and inspecting their contents. In 1868, he published the first edition of Historical Memorials of Westminster Abbey, in which he provided detailed descriptions of various monuments dating back hundreds of years. He included a chapter on Poets' Corner in his text, and he admitted that by the early 19th century, the place had lost its charm. The prospect of Stanley's burying Dickens in the National Shrine would have raised the profile of both Poets' Corner and the Dean himself. Andrew Sanders, in his introduction to his short Oxford History of English Literature, reminds us that the growth of Poets' Corner mirrors a conscious effort to create a canonical British literary tradition. Dickens was cemented within this pantheon through his burial in the Abbey, and in his wake followed Browning, Tennyson, the ashes of Hardy and Kipling, together with memorials to Longfellow, Burns, Coleridge, Scott, Ruskin, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Brontes, and the rest. Now we can turn to the other major influencer in the quest to bury Dickens in the Abbey. Jon Forster was the author's intimate friend, literary agent, guardian of many secrets, authorized biographer, and one of the two executors of his will. He was away in Cornwall when Dickens collapsed, and it took him 2 days to reach Gad's Hill. When he arrived at the country house on Saturday, the 11th of June, he was overcome with grief at the death of his friend, and clearly unprepared for the suddenness with which the blow was struck. According to the official account, Forster's first thoughts, and those of the immediate family, were to accede to Dickens's wishes and have him buried close to home. This is made clear in the final volume of his Life of Charles Dickens, published in 1874. He records that Dickens would himself have preferred to lie in the small graveyard under Rochester Castle wall, or in the little churches of Cobham or Shorn, but all of these were found to be closed. The marginal note to this passage emphasizes the point. It reads, "his own wish." Despite what Forster claims, there is no corroborating evidence in parish records to confirm either that Dickens ever considered burial in any of these locations, or that any of these schemes was actually put into practice. A scheme that was quickly advanced, however, by the Vice Dean and Chapter of Rochester Cathedral was to bury Dickens there in the Lady Chapel. In fact, the initiative was costed and invoiced. The chapter archives demonstrate that a grave was in fact dug by the building firm John Ford and Sons. The records also show that the cathedral authorities believed, as they still believe, that is, after Dickens is buried on the Abbey, that no more fitting or honourable spot for his sepulture could be found than amidst scenes to which he was fondly attached, and amongst those by whom he was personally known as a neighbour and held in such honour. These views are reinforced by the claims of Dickens's sister-in-law Georgina Hogarth in a letter to her friend Mary Howitt. She said, We should have preferred Rochester Cathedral, and it was a great disappointment to the people there that we had to give way to the larger demand, that is, burial in the Abbey. Rochester would have been a sort of shrine to him. He loved the place so much. It was the home of his boyhood, and close to the dear home of his last years. And the scenes of his first and last book are laid there. Plans for the Rochester burial were clearly well advanced, even though Forster severely underplays this initiative in his biography. He simply records the desire to lay him in the cathedral had been entertained. Stanley stuck to the same story. In his manuscript recollections preserved in the Abbey's monuments or archives, Stanley doesn't mention burial in a vault in Rochester as a possibility. Instead, he only records that apparently the funeral was to take place in Rochester. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he was making extraordinary efforts to get the family and Forster to agree to interment in Poets' Corner. Things came to a head on Monday, the 13th of June, but not in the way recorded in official accounts. We've heard how Stanley wrote to Lord Houghton that day, asking him to intervene with the grieving family. There also appeared that morning a leader in the Times that called for Dickens to be buried in the Abbey. I've published the text with commentary in the latest issue of the Dickensian because it was missing from both microfilm and online versions of the paper. It merits careful attention on account of its language and of its timing. It praises Stanley himself in these words: "The Dean of Westminster is not precluded from preferring a request that Dickens may be buried in the only tomb in England worthy of him. The present Dean is distinguished for his appreciation of the national character of the Abbey over which he presides, and will, we are sure, be as anxious as anyone to add this great name to those it already enshrines." I've demonstrated today just how great Stanley's anxiety was to add Dickens's name to the Abbey register. The leader then turned to the Dickens family in these words: "Should such a proposal be made to the representatives of Dickens, and should they be disposed to yield to it, they may at least be sure that popular feeling will absolve them of any disrespect to the wishes of the dead." The leader writer could have learned of Dickens's own wishes from the family, who had already provided the paper with details of Dickens's stroke, the visits of his doctors, and the manner of his death, for articles published on Friday the 10th and Saturday the 11th of June. The leader concluded with this appeal: "Let him lie in the Abbey, where Englishmen gather to review the memorials of the great masters and teachers of their nation. The ashes and the name of the greatest instructor of the 19th century should not be absent." There was no one who was more interested in the Abbey's memorials than Stanley himself, who had published the authoritative text on the subject 2 years earlier. The question arises then, did Stanley have any influence on the leader in the Times? In a piece for which I was interviewed, published in the Times in February of this year, the chief reporter, Sean O'Neill, disclosed that the dean had a close connection with the newspaper. The brother-in-law he had lobbied about conducting the funeral, Frederick Locker, had a brother, Arthur Locker, who was a regular Times book reviewer from 1865 to 1870. O'Neill speculates that he might even have written the piece published on Monday, the 13th of June. The Times in 2020 gave serious consideration to the issue of its abetting the plot to bury Dickens in the Abbey. In a leader published on the 4th of February this year, we find this expression of regret: "The power of the word explains the campaign to inter a giant of English letters in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. Charles Dickens had specified his wish to be buried in a private ceremony near his home in Kent. Yet, his sudden death in 1870, a Times leader called for Dickens to be buried in the Abbey, the peculiar resting place of English literary genius. It is time to set the record straight. We can now reveal that popular pressure to inter Dickens in Poets' Corner was largely an invention in which this paper connived, and it is time to show due contrition." But we should return to Jon Forster, because in his account, he confirms that it was this leader that convinced Stanley that Dickens should be buried in the Abbey.